Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the False Start Fantasy Podcast, where I'll be going over a secret boom bust formula that I may have just discovered for finding boom and bust players, specifically wide receivers, after the NFL draft once we get into the redraft season. Now, I am of course very late on this or potentially very early for next year. But I will be talking about what that will look like for the future, and I just wanted to share this information as I had just discovered it. So now the point of this discussion is it all stems from the idea of what happens to a team's wide receiver one when the team drafts a wide receiver in the first round. So as we all know, free agency for the most part happens before the NFL draft, and of course there's some trades and moves after that, but generally the team has a wide receiver one already on the team by the time the draft comes around, and we need to know what happens to those players in fantasy football. Now, between 2021 and 2015, this was how far back I did my research, there were 28 wide receiver ones that were replaced with their team's first round pick. I have them all right here. You can see the rookies, so Ja'Marr Chase, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Kadarius Toney for recent players, and they were set in to replace guys like T. Higgins, Jalen Reagor, Will Fuller, Kenny Golladay, and I chose the veteran by their ADP according to myfantasyleague.com. Now, I went all the way back to 2015, as I'm going to discuss later. We may want to cut that off at 2017, and I'll go ahead and bring that up later. Now, of those 28 wide receiver ones, so these are the guys who are the already established player on that roster. 7 of those players were injured, so suspended, so I decided to remove all of their data from all of my tables and all of my averages that I'll go ahead and share later. But it should be mentioned that obviously, of course, those 7 players who were injured / suspended ended up being busts. Now, 8 of these 28 players finished horribly below their expected draft spot, and I'll go into later how horribly they were, but it of course goes case by case, determining on their ADP, but all of them finished way beyond anything that you would expect. Now, of those 8, only 3 of those players were drafted inside the top 24 wide receivers drafted by positional. Now, 13 of these 28 wide receiver ones finished above / around their expected draft spot, and of those 13, only 3 were drafted outside the top 24. Now I'll go ahead and show you in the graph and a little bit better on the left-hand side here what that means. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there is a veteran player here listed there. You can see their ADP is in the second column here, and the difference between where their ADP was versus where they actually finished is on the right here and noted as difference. So T. Higgins in 2021 was drafted as the wide receiver 24 and finished exactly at the wide receiver 24. Jalen Reagor was drafted as the wide receiver 63 and finished as the wide receiver 96. So not a great return there. And you can even go here to 63 minus 33 and look, there is Jalen Reagor looking like a big old bum. Now, your first instinct may be that not all of the players are noted here, and that is, of course, because Chris Moore in 2019, who was drafted as a wide receiver 54, so a horrible investment, but slightly above Jalen Reagor and slightly below Marquise Brown, finished as the wide receiver 187. And if I were to plot that, he would be so far down here that all the rest of these points are very difficult to see, so I decided to remove him there, but just know that he is listed, and I also did not include him on the averages for the busts right here. Now, we notice on the left-hand side here that there are a lot of players who were drafted around the top 12, top 24 that finished around that spot, but a few players, so minus 12 right here when being drafted at the 9 spot. T.Y. Hilton finished 12 spots behind that at wide receiver 21. I do consider that to be a bust. And I consider any player that did not finish within 6 spots of where they were drafted, including these guys who were drafted wide receiver ones, to be a bust. I'll go more into that later. But any guys below, if there was a dotted line here, were all considered busts. So everyone below that and everyone above that I would consider to be good value or great value. In the case of Michael Crabtree, who was being drafted as a wide receiver 57 and finished as the wide receiver 16 on the season. So definitely some excellent value there for when you were drafting him, and quite a pleasant surprise there. That was the year that Amari Cooper was drafted to the Las Vegas, or at the time, Oakland Raiders. Now, I mentioned that 2015 and 2016 were definitely some of those surprising factors. And when I go into that in a moment, you'll see that a lot of these outliers that you would expect are going to actually disappear. So between 2021 and 2017, 18 wide receiver ones were replaced with their team's first round pick. 5 of those were injured / suspended. Your Josh Gordons, your Will Fullers were suspended. Your Deshaun Jacksons, your Deebo Samuels were injured, so I removed them when creating my averages later. But 5 of those 18 wide receiver ones finished horribly below their expected draft spot, and every single one of those 5 players finished outside the top 24. And the 8 players that finished above / around their expected draft spot, only one of those players finished outside the top 24, and that is Marquise Brown, who is shown here, who was, as I had mentioned earlier, drafted as a wide receiver 51 and finished way above that, finishing 29 spots higher than the wide receiver 51, proving himself to be an outlier, but not as much as Chris Moore, who once again is not on this. But you can see that all of these players who were finished inside the top 24, every single one of them did not bust on their draft value. And that is an interesting discussion there. You can say that, oh, well, the rookie wide receiver that they drafted in the first round was just then used as a great way for getting the veteran player open and getting them more space. You can say whatever argument you want there, but we know that these elite players were not replaced by the rookie talent, whereas these guys who were drafted outside of the top 24, and it is immediate, they are finishing horribly with an average expected bust difference of -28. So these guys all down here, including Marquise Brown, not including Chris Moore, all finished on average 28 spots below where you were drafting them. Whereas the guys who were expected boom, so these guys who were drafted within the top 24, had an average difference of only -1.3. And if you're drafting a player within the top 24, and we can even go further here in Julian Edelman, 2019, who was being drafted as a wide receiver 14, finishing within 1.3 spots, even if it is below where you drafted them, that is a huge success rate. So guys like that are definitely good players to have. So I went ahead and listed here, as we know, ADP players who were being drafted within the top 24. T. Higgins finishing as a 24, 10, 15, 7, 4, 12, 10. All these players from 2017 to 2021, excellent booms there, finishing very well within your draft capital, where all these players were finishing outside the top 24, except for Marquise Brown in 2021. Horrible return on your draft here. And those of you who may be looking a little bit ahead are already thinking about this year. Well, what does that mean for the players? Well, I went ahead and looked at my fantasy league ADP, and there were 2 players who were drafted within the top 24. That is Terry McLaurin, who was drafted as wide receiver 18, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was drafted as a wide receiver 21. And currently, those 2 players are wide receivers 22 and wide receivers 27. So both are currently within the 6 spots that I had laid out as returning on your value, though we hope that these 2 players start to pick it up a little bit more. Amon-Ra St. Brown has definitely missed some time for injury, and Terry McLaurin is having some QB issues, so we hope that those numbers go up, but we will check in again on that at the end of this season. Whereas on the other side, if we had known this data before, we all could have avoided Michael Thomas, Elijah Moore, Robert Wood, and I imagine most of us avoided Bryan Edwards anyways. Could have missed out completely on the bust that these 4 players are, as, of course, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Treylon Burks, and Drake London were all drafted to those teams in the first round of the NFL draft. So in conclusion, NFL wide receivers whose team drafted a wide receiver in the first round of the NFL draft that same year are very likely to finish horribly behind their ADP position. And elite wide receivers, so those who have ADPs within the top 24, those players whose teams went and got them a first round teammate wide receiver finish very highly in return on the value that we expect of them. That concludes today's special episode. Thank you all so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below, hit me up on Twitter, or join the Discord community in the description. I'll see you all next week before the ball is snapped.